The old alchemist's workshop is silent, crucibles cold, bellows still, soot settling like forgotten prayers. But the real furnace was never made of brick. It is hidden behind the ribs inside the nervous system, inside the stories you repeat until they feel like you. In every era, seekers chased a single rumor that a human life can be transmuted without changing your outer circumstances first. The secret is not positive thinking. It is heat, not physical flame, but psychic fire, pressure, contradiction, humiliation, longing, grief forces that melt rigid identity. A Renaissance healer once hinted that the true operator must treat the soul as carefully as the body, because the work happens in the microcosm of consciousness. Centuries later, a Zurich analyst uncovered a strange parallel. The coded images in obscure manuscripts mirrored inner stages of transformation. 4 fires, 4 ordeals, each a psychological operation, not to become perfect, but to become whole. In the hidden philosophy of the old adepts, the great work was described with metals and furnaces because direct confession was dangerous, and because symbols reach where ordinary language fails. What looked like chemistry was often autobiography of the psyche. The vessel was attention, the laboratory was the inner life. And the prima materia was whatever in you feels crude, reactive, compulsive, or unfinished. One key to this system is a triad of principles. 3 forces that appear under different names in many traditions. The first is the heavy principle, structure, habit, embodiment, the part of you that resists change and calls it stability. The second is the burning principle, desire, ambition, rage, devotion, the engine that consumes and transforms. The third is the moving principle, imagination, mediation, mind, the capacity to shift perspectives and unite contradictions. When these 3 are tangled, life feels fated. You repeat patterns, defend the same wounds, choose familiar suffering. The work begins when you stop asking for comfort and start asking for truth. Across esoteric lineages, the triad becomes a map. In certain mystical diagrams, 3 columns hold the world upright: constraint, expansion, and the balancing path between them. In older Christian currents, especially the more interior, contemplative strains, the human being is also seen as layered. Body that anchors, soul that feels, spirit that knows. Different vocabularies, same architecture. The point is not doctrine. The point is proportion. If the heavy principle dominates, you become rigid and fear masquerades as reason. If the burning principle dominates, you become possessed by passion, ideology, addiction, romance, or revenge. If the moving principle dominates, you become ungrounded, living in concepts, fantasies, and spiritual language that never touches daily life. The adepts insisted that transformation requires a deliberate faculty, concentrated intention. Not the frantic will of ego trying to control everything, but the steadier power that can sustain an inner experiment through discomfort. And because power amplifies what is already inside you, they warned of a moral law without humility and discernment. Work becomes vanity mysticism as performance, spirituality as status. So the fires begin with a demand, brutal honesty. The 4 fires are not motivational stages. They are ordeals that strip a person of inherited identity. Each fire performs a different operation on the psyche. One burns, one washes, one separates, one unites. Taken together, they form a cycle of breaking and remaking, an inner rite of passage that appears in myth, initiation, and certain forms of therapy. But a warning must be spoken at the door of the laboratory. These fires are not toys. If you force them prematurely through reckless practices, obsession, isolation, or spiritual grandiosity, you can destabilize what you are not prepared to rebuild. The old schools emphasized containment, a grounded life, ethical discipline, supportive relationships, and practices that stabilize the nervous system. The goal is not to escape reality, but to see it without the distortions of your complexes. When the process is entered responsibly, the first fire arrives like a verdict, the collapse of the persona. The mask doesn't fall gently, it burns. Your self-image meets reality and loses. This is where the work truly starts, when the stories you used to survive stop working. Fire 1. Calcination. The blackening the first fire is ruthless. It reduces what you thought was you into ash. Psychologically, this is the confrontation with the rejected self, traits you disowned to be loved, impulses you buried to be good, vulnerabilities you hid to appear strong. Many people meet this fire through crisis, career failure, betrayal, illness, humiliation, exile from a community, or the slow horror of realizing you've built a life that doesn't belong to you. The old texts called it the blackening, because the inner world turns opaque, meaning dims, certainty rots. Your familiar identity decomposes. In modern terms, it can resemble depression, but there is a critical difference. Here, the breakdown contains information. It is not only suffering, it is exposure. The psyche reveals what your persona has been protecting you from seeing, resentment you called patience, control you called responsibility, fear you called logic. The temptation is to rebuild the mask quickly, new goals, new beliefs, new distractions. But calcination demands you stay with the heat long enough for the counterfeit to burn away. In calcination, resistance becomes fuel. Every yes, but is tinder. The psyche tightens, defending its old architecture, because the ego fears one thing more than pain: dissolution of control. This is why the fire often feels like punishment. Yet the hidden function is purification. The fire does not destroy what is real. It destroys what is pretended. Two failures commonly occur here. The first is denial. You explain everything away, blame everyone else, spiritualize the problem, or medicate it into silence. Then rebuild the same identity with new paint. The second is fascination with darkness. You become loyal to your suffering, addicted to crisis, confusing intensity with depth. In both cases, you do not pass through the blackening, you settle inside it. A wiser posture is observation, not cold detachment, but the capacity to witness the burning without narrating it into melodrama. This is the beginning of inner sovereignty, realizing you are not identical with your moods, your history, your social role, or your defenses. The first fire teaches the most offensive lesson of all. You were not betrayed by life. You were betrayed by illusion. When the ashes cool, a new operation begins, less violent, more intimate. The second fire is not flame. It is solvent. Fire 2. Dissolution. The whitening after the first fire. The psyche is brittle. Dissolution begins where rigidity ends. If calcination breaks the mask, dissolution washes the residue out of the nervous system. This is the stage of softening, the return of feeling, the thawing of what was frozen in order to function. Where the first fire says, "Your story is false," the second says, "Now feel what the story was protecting you from." Dissolution is not dramatic insight, it is emotional truth. Mourning that arrives late, tears that were postponed for years, anger you never admitted because it threatened your identity as the good one. Longing that was buried under achievement. It often appears as fatigue, vulnerability, and a strange sensitivity to music, memory, and dreams. The psyche begins to speak in images again, in symbolic language. This is a lunar phase, reflective, receptive, intuitive, not weakness cleansing. The danger here is drowning, becoming lost in emotion, romanticizing pain, confusing catharsis with transformation. Dissolution must be guided. A water is healing, but it needs a vessel. Dissolution also dismantles crude binaries, strong versus weak, pure versus tainted, winner versus failure. Those oppositions were often armor. As they soften, a different inner figure awakens, the mediator. In-depth psychology. This appears as the psyche's bridge between conscious identity and the vast underground of the unconscious. It may arrive through dreams, sudden empathy, a new ability to listen, or the unsettling realization that traits you despised in others were exiled parts of yourself. This is why old traditions sometimes framed the whitening as purification, not moral purity, psychic clarity. You begin to sense what is genuinely yours versus what you absorbed from family, culture, or fear. You notice how many of your opinions are inherited reflexes. You see how often you perform strength to avoid being known. Practically, this stage shows up as simple acts that feel revolutionary. Telling the truth without theatrics, apologizing without self-hatred, setting boundaries without cruelty, letting your chest soften instead of tightening. It is a return to inner moisture, humanity restored to a psyche that survived by hardening. But water alone cannot complete the work. If you only soften, you may become kind yet confused. The third fire is required, discrimination, a sharpening that does not reharden the heart, but clarifies the path. Fire 3, separation. The yellowing, the third fire, introduces a different kind of heat, the heat of discernment. Separation is where you stop confusing insight with intoxication. It is the stage that exposes spiritual theatrics, self-deception, and the ego's talent for imitation. After the softening of dissolution, the psyche can become suggestible, hungry for meaning, desperate for a new identity. This is where people trade one prison for a more poetic one. The old adepts called this the yellowing, the dawn of a solar intelligence that illuminates without scorching. Psychologically, it is the capacity to hold opposites in awareness without collapsing into one side. You can feel grief without making it your personality. You can recognize anger without obeying it. You can sense intuition without letting fear disguise itself as prophecy. Separation asks precise questions. Is this boundary protection or avoidance? Is this practice opening me or numbing me? Is this calling genuine or a compensation for shame? The work becomes less emotional and more exacting. You begin to sort the subtle from the seductive. This fire is not cynical, it is honest. And honesty is what prepares the psyche for the final operation, union. Separation is where many seekers quietly fail because it demands an insult to vanity. The ego wants a victory narrative. I healed, I awakened, I transcended. But the third fire reveals how easily spiritual language becomes camouflage. You can meditate to avoid conflict. You can study esotericism to feel superior. You can talk about shadow work while refusing to change your daily habits. This stage refines the intellect rather than abolishing it. Certain traditions speak of going beyond the mind, but the mind must first be sharpened into an instrument of truth. Separation is the moment you begin to detect your own strategies in real time. The rationalizations, the moral posturing, the compulsive need to be seen as wise. The yellowing is the birth of a cleaner light one that exposes not only darkness but performance. Practically, this is where life reorganizes. You start choosing values consciously rather than by inertia. You notice which relationships feed your growth and which keep you small. You stop outsourcing meaning to authorities, teachers, trends, even sacred texts, and begin verifying through lived experience. This is the beginning of vocation, not what you should do, but what your deepest nature demands. And once the elements are separated and purified, the work can attempt its most dangerous act, conjunction. Fire 4, conjunction. The reddening, the final fire is synthesis. Conjunction is not a return to childish unity, not a blissful merging that erases tension. It is a higher integration that preserves distinctions while creating wholeness. The old emblem for this operation was the sacred marriage, sun and moon, king and queen, above and below, opposites reconciled without being flattened. Psychologically, conjunction is when consciousness can contain the unconscious without being flooded by it. The ego stops acting as tyrant or servant and becomes a function of the deeper self. You still have personality, preferences, and limitations, but they no longer rule you from the shadows. Your instincts are included, not demonized. Your tenderness is included, not mocked. Your strength is included, not inflated into domination. The reddening points to embodied spirit, wisdom that reaches the hands, the voice, the calendar, the way you speak to strangers. This is where the work becomes practical. You do not escape life. You enter it without self-betrayal. Creativity returns because it is no longer blocked by shame. Leadership becomes possible because you are less driven by approval. Love deepens because projection weakens. Yet even here, the path is not safe. Between stages, an abyss opens, especially before this final union. The abyss is the part the modern self-help world rarely admits. It is the interval where the old identity is dead, but the new integration has not stabilized. In this space, the psyche can interpret transformation as failure. The work feels pointless, symbols go silent, practices lose their sweetness. The mind asks, what if this is all fantasy? Mystics describe this as spiritual desolation, the stripping of consolations so the soul cannot cling to them as proof. Depth psychology describes it as an encounter with overwhelming inner magnitude, forces so vast that the ego fears annihilation. The old manuscripts pictured it as total blackness inside the vessel, the moment when the matter seems ruined beyond recovery. This crisis is not automatically pathological, but it can become dangerous without containment. The difference often comes down to structure, a disciplined routine, grounded friendships, a therapist or mentor, a tradition that provides orientation, and the willingness to continue without guarantees. Without such support, some collapse into nihilism, despair, or fragmentation. The paradox is brutal. You must endure meaninglessness without using meaning as a sedative. This is the death that makes space for rebirth. Once the psyche survives this interval, conjunction stops being an idea and becomes a lived condition, quiet, unshowy, and unmistakable. What emerges after the abyss is not a new costume. It is a new relationship to experience. Cognitively, the integrated person develops a double vision. You can act from the personal I, while simultaneously sensing a deeper organizing center that is not obsessed with image. This produces a rare form of confidence without the need for certainty. You can commit, build, lead, and love while remaining corrigible. Emotionally, integration does not shrink feeling, it expands it. The range becomes wider, but reactivity becomes lower. You can feel anger without becoming cruelty. You can feel sadness without becoming collapse. You can feel joy without turning it into mania. The psyche stops oscillating between inflation and humiliation because it is no longer trying to secure identity through extremes. Ethically, something subtle changes. Right action becomes less performative. You stop doing good to be seen as good. You stop obeying rules out of fear. Instead, response arises from wholeness, like a hand pulling away from heat without needing a philosophy. This is not moral perfection. It is coherence, and coherence has consequences. It alters relationships, work, creativity, even the way suffering is experienced. Pain remains, but the extra suffering produced by resistance begins to dissolve. Here, the esoteric traditions deliver their most uncomfortable demand. The work is not completed in private. The gold must return to the world. Integration that serves only personal serenity is considered incomplete because wholeness naturally expresses itself, not through preaching, but through presence, decisions, and the quality of attention you bring into ordinary life. This is where certain neglected early Christian currents, often labeled Gnostic by their opponents, become psychologically illuminating. They treated salvation less as external transaction and more as awakening, liberation through inner knowledge, the recognition of what is real beneath the false rulers of the psyche. Read this way. The figure of the teacher becomes an emblem of consciousness, entering a trapped world, not to escape matter, but to redeem perception. The kingdom is not a map location, it is a mode of seeing. In daily terms, the return looks modest, speaking truth without cruelty, refusing roles that require self-abandonment, ending cycles of projection, creating rather than consuming, taking responsibility without self-hatred. You become harder to manipulate, not because you are guarded, but because you are less divided. And this division is the real imprisonment. The 4 fires are a method for breaking the internal regime that keeps you predictable. When you are no longer predictable, you are free. So the Magnum Opus is not a metaphor for changing your life. It is a map for changing the one who lives it. The first fire burns away the counterfeit self. The second dissolves the armor so feeling can return. The third separates truth from performance. The fourth unites what was split until you can move through the world without abandoning yourself. And, if you listen carefully, you can detect these fires already operating in your biography. The humiliation you never got over, the grief you kept postponing, the relationship that forced you to see your projections, the moment you realized your old ambitions were borrowed. None of it was random. It was raw material. The question is not whether you will face fire. The question is whether you will cooperate with it consciously, because unconscious fire feels like fate. Conscious fire becomes initiation if you regulate the flame through discipline, reflection, ethical seriousness, and grounded support. The furnace does not destroy you, it refines you. The ancient promise was never instant enlightenment. It was something quieter and more demanding, that the gold you seek is a quality of awareness, that the stone is a state of being, and that freedom begins the moment you stop defending your illusions and choose the courage to know yourself, fully without bargaining.